Launch and Learn is relationship. So the story I wanted to share with you has to do about my relationship with one of the communities I work with. Their name is Amupakin. It's a collective of Quechua doulas and midwives in the Amazon region in the rainforest. So here are two of the mamas, Mama Adela and Mama Maria Narvaez. And we're in a traditional structure that is used now is used for educational purposes, but traditionally is used for birthing practices and ceremonies. So I've been working with the mamas now working and sharing a relationship with them for about 4 to 5 years now, and so we've gone through a lot together. And I remember that around year 2 or 3, they started to call me son. We would be having meetings, and they would refer to me as like son, and then to other people as Hera, like our son. So first I thought like, okay, that's like people in Canada, like older people would call me, hey son, can you pass me the water? And it's sort of like a normal, usual way of speaking. But then I started to pay attention to how they use the word, and um, trying not to trivialize what they say, but to take it as something true and serious. So I was trying to make sense of what they meant when they said son, because we work together. I'm not their biological son. Um, and The way that I made sense of it was by thinking about our interactions. So I thought about the ways in which they relate to me, and I realized that they do actually treat me like their son or like their child in some ways. Um, just to give you a few examples, one of the years I got spider bites all over my ankles because I wasn't wearing the proper shoes to walk around the gardens. So I told one of the mamas, and she sat me down, grabbed my food, put it on her lap, grabbed some leaves and different medicines from her bag, and just treat me and rub my food and sang a song. And the next day I was just perfectly fine. Um, I also remember the time that I jumped off a cliff because I was very excited to be in the Amazon and having the chance to jump off a waterfall. And I came out, and three of the mamas were just scolding me and saying, "You're not supposed to do that. You're gonna hurt yourself. You're setting a bad example for your students." And just they basically treated me like a child in front of my students, which is fine. And there's other examples of things like that. They're always chasing me, making sure that I have enough food. After meals, they come back and they're like, "Hera, did you eat enough? We like made you this because you're very skinny." Okay, same things my mom say to me. And then I started to also think of the ways that I relate to them, and that in the ways that they have made me relate to them, also as their son. So one year we went to out of their communities. So this is a hot spring site, like hours away from where they live. One of the mamas lost an earring, so I had to dive through the different pools and run around the hot springs looking for the lost earring. I couldn't find it, but I did spend a good time looking, so I think they forgave me for that. Whenever we're outside of the community, they load me with their bags, so I'm like carrying everyone's bags plus my own. They always expect me to make sure they're comfortable and safe, and if there's any unexpected expenses in the community. Like recently, one of the mamas passed away, so they came to me to ask for help for the funeral because I am a son. So it's been really beautiful how that relationship has developed. But for me, what's interesting is that it didn't really click until I was working on this framework, on this project, and then reflecting on what words they use and what does it actually look like in our relationship. So and how those doors were open by me following the lead of the community. Because when I call them mamas, I just use the word very loosely, but when they call me son, they really meant something. So to me, this is one of the stories that really illustrates what a relationship could develop into with our partners when we put in the time to reflect on how we interact, but also when we're willing to follow the lead of our community partners. So yeah, that's the story. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so much for sharing that story, Hedda. And during the presentation today, I'll probably relate some of the things that we're talking to back to that. So keep that in mind, and it'll be part of the recording for folks who might have to leave early today. But we'll just jump into relationship. So you know, we, as you probably know, if you've been attending some of the some of these lunch and learns, we conducted consultations over a 2-year period, starting 3 years ago, back in 2018. And it became really apparent early on that this principle of relationship was a fundamental or core principle of Indigenous community engagement. We think of it as the heart or essence of Indigenous community engagement. It was something that our consultations always went back to, the importance of building essentially a different kind of relationship between partners and practitioners and community members. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we heard in our consultations and what that looks like and why we should do this and how we should do this. So some of the things that we heard, and you know, through our own analysis of all of the consultations, we, as I mentioned, realized that relationship is a core element of each stage of engagement. So we showed you that pathway in earlier presentations, and you can sort of see it on the background of this slide here. There are 5 stages of Indigenous community engagement, and relationship is a really important part of each of those stages. It's also informed and strengthened by the other 6 principles, actually. Relationship is one of the 7. So, you know, by developing our literacy in Indigenous topics, by reflecting on our own story and our ways of learning, working, and relating, by researching and respecting protocols, by cultivating and practicing humility, by making sure that our partners guide, direct, and benefit from our work together, and by advocating for these different approaches to and funding for relationship building, relationship maintenance, and relational accountability, we demonstrate a determined commitment to prioritize whole relationships, and we can actually approach and build relationships with Indigenous partners in a good way. So working in good ways is taking this different approach to community engagement. So this is a quote here from Negon Sinclair that he shared with us during the consultations. But essentially, you know, what we heard was that the kinds of relationships that we create with Indigenous communities and prospective partners are likely going to be different than these like typical professional partnerships that we've experienced in the past or that we're used to. So, you know, professional, quote unquote, professional relationships often take place during regular work hours. They come with firm boundaries about what's appropriate to share and discuss, and some inflexible assumptions about how we relate to each other. You know, it's the idea of, you know, how are you? And you just expect me to say fine and move on and ask you about the weather kind of thing. And we don't really have deep conversations. We probably aren't talking about our families, or really getting into the nitty gritty of what life is like. So, you know, these professional partnerships often feel transactional in nature. So it's an exchange of services and resources. You know, we'll give you a little bit of cash to host our students, or, you know, to do this research project with us, rather than these partnerships that are based in relationship, which is what we heard from community that they want and expect. And in the consultations, both, you know, community partners and university practitioners used words like love, family, and lifelong relationships to describe their relationships with each other. And you just heard Hedda say those things. But there's an important caveat here. So it is important to also recognize that, you know, not all of our partnerships are going to become personal in nature. They're not going to all require these like long periods of relationship building. And they might not all become these like lifelong lasting relationships. We're going to develop different kinds of relationships with community partners, you know, especially with diverse community members too. Some might be close, some maybe not so close. And in a few lucky cases, our relationships, you know, hopefully will naturally progress beyond the partnership or project. This is what we heard communities want in some cases, right? So the important caveat is just follow the community's lead. Don't try and, you know, force a friendship or a family relationship on our partners, but be prepared if you are engaging with Indigenous communities to engage in what may become a long-term relationship if that's what they want or expect. So, you know, in our consultations too, we heard from other folks who were saying, well, why bother building these kinds of relationships? It's just, you know, this is my work and I'm just trying to build a partnership here. So, you know, we heard again that relationships should precede and outlive our programs, but relationships always also sustain these partnerships and collaborations that we have, right? We heard from folks that we consulted with that it makes the work more fulfilling to spend time with each other, to become a part of community life, to stay in touch. Doing these things, you know, staying in touch, spending time, getting out, skidooing, going fishing if folks ask you to, they you know demonstrate that they help us build trust and heal past harms. And we know that when Indigenous communities are partnering with institutions like the university, that there are probably past harms that we are going to have to heal and work through, because we have this long history of, you know, doing extractive research or having exploitative engagements and collaborations. So putting in the time to build these stronger relationships, help us be better partners, and help the institution, you know, by extension of us working with that, to be better partners to Indigenous communities. Another thing we heard about why we should do this is that it actually helps mitigate challenges. So if we can like demonstrate respect, build trust, show humility, you know, folks are actually going to trust that if they bring us challenges or share barriers that they're experiencing with us, that we're actually going to do something about it. So it actually improves communication, and it makes the partnership better for both parties, and helps us address those like challenges and barriers that they might bring up to us. So the next few slides are about how we actually go about doing this. So it's easy to say build these deep relationships with folks, but what does that actually look like in terms of like your, you know, project plans and your, you know, community visits and other like project activities, and like how do you work these into work plans and job descriptions, etc. So, you know, the first thing is prioritizing relationships. So we have to take time to build relationships and earn trust before proposing partnerships. And a lot of folks say, you know, well, is that really possible? Yeah, it is. We actually heard from lots of practitioners working at the university who did just that. So Darian Morton, who was a guest advisor a couple of weeks ago for the Work Before the Work Lunch and Learn, he actually spent 6 months getting to know community leaders before he asked them to collaborate in his graduate level research. Another professor and practitioner in the Department of Community Health Sciences took several international trips to meet with the community before the work even started, before he proposed a partnership. And another Indigenous community engagement coordinator from the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences spent 2 years attending community events, getting to know folks, building relationships before, you know, her real work began, which was connecting with community. So folks are actually out there, they're doing this, they're spending time in community, spending time building relationships before they're asking communities to build partnerships. So it is possible, and it's partly about advocating for institutional support for relationship building. So we know that there are challenges and barriers. We know that our supervisors might say, yeah, I'm not giving you 6 months to just, and, you know, and letting you go visit the community 3 times if there's not going to be necessarily something to show for it. So we need to take on that burden, you know, as practitioners, as folks working in the institution and at the university, take on that burden of explaining the importance of relationship building to our supervisors and funders, especially when we're wanting to work with Indigenous communities. So we have to ask for money, time, and other resources that are needed to work in good ways. The next sort of big thing falls under a category we call honoring relationality. And relationality is a it's a principle that forms a foundation of an Indigenous paradigm. And it essentially is the way that Indigenous peoples understand, relate to, and interact with each other, with the natural world, with Indigenous knowledges, and more. So it's this recognition that, you know, all things are related. So anyways, these are some of the practices that we've sort of put under this category. And, you know, Hedda talked about this as well, right? That it's like honoring these like family relationships that he has developed with his community partners in the Amazon. So be present and spend time with people. I mean, it's apparent, right? Show up, attend community events if we can, visit, you know, bring bannock and tea if you go to community. Something that we heard that is important to share here is that if possible, do this on your own time, because something that was like a kind of a point of frustration among partners was that a lot of times they're expected to spend time with you without getting paid, right? Outside of work hours. So we should reciprocate, no strings attached, and attend community events and spend time with people on our own time too, right? Outside of work hours if possible. Another big thing, maintain communication between visits and projects. So just keep in touch, visit, call, check in. Lots of folks might have partners that are too far away to visit regularly, like Hedda's partners are in Ecuador and Chile, but he spends a lot of time with them online, on, you know, video calls, engaging with their social media. And again, here, there's a call to like continue advocating within our institution for support for relationship building for this too, because it would be great if Hedda was able to visit partners in between projects when he doesn't have students with him, right? Next, develop personal and whole relationships. So again, just a reminder to be prepared for the possibility that these professional relationships, you know, may evolve into friendships or even family relationships, and that communities might expect these to be lasting or even lifelong, frankly. So we're going to talk about the responsibilities that go along with this idea on the next slide. But we have to give ourselves permission to have fun, to build friendships, and to share who we are as people outside of our roles and our work at the institution. Be respectful and adaptive. So literally listen, observe, learn, you know, adapt to the ways that of working and communicating in the community. Importantly here, we have to manage our own prejudices and culture shock. So in one of our communities that we had consulted with, we heard about this situation of a student who was essentially refusing to remove their shoes in a community member's home because they thought it was kind of messy. And that instance really damaged relationships between the community and not only the student, but the university as well, because the community felt like that we as an institution, you know, sending students into community where they were going to be hosted should have put a lot of more time and effort into training our students, preparing them, developing their literacy and critical reflection skills. So that's also an important reminder too, that it's not necessarily just us. If students are being hosted in the community, we have to do the work of making sure that we're training them too and preparing them for that. And then finally, be humble and helpful. Literally stack the chairs, do the dishes. You know, when we make community visits, Annie and I in northern Manitoba, we do the dishes if there's like a stack there. If we've had a cup of coffee, right? We're gonna clean our own dishes. If you're at a community event, help stack chairs afterwards. Lots of communities are looking for funding. You know, write a draft of a funding proposal for them if that's something they need. Type up the minutes at the meeting. Don't expect, you know, community to do this sort of like admin work necessarily that we can do. At our first Lunch and Learn series for Working in Good Ways that we hosted back in winter 2020, Dr. Carrie Miller, the department head of Native Studies, reminded us to be willing to do the work without asking for anything in return. And so finally, in the, you know, how do we do this? What does this look like? We have relational accountability. So relational accountability is another important principle that informs an Indigenous worldview or paradigm. And it means essentially that we're responsible for caring for the relationships that we have. So not just with people, but with everything, with the whole of creation. So Hedda, in his story, he talked about his responsibility to honor and reciprocate the family relationships that he's developed with his partners. And he shared, a good example of being there to support the costs of a funeral when one of the community members passed. So a couple of the practices that we heard about in the consultations that sort of fall under this are assuming institutional accountability. So, one of the stories that had come out from the consultations was that when Annie started working in Northern Manitoba many years ago, I think she's on her 6th year of delivering the Leaf Rapids program, she and the students that she had brought up were met with a lot of distrust due to the community's previous experiences with universities and other colonial institutions. Community members literally came to her and said, like, why are you here? What is the point of this program? How long are you even spending in this community? In fact, the program is a month long, but even then they thought that's a really short time to have students here. And they asked, what is the benefit for us of you coming here, right? Like, how does this benefit us? So rather than like denying those concerns or becoming defensive, it's really important to listen to people's concerns and then actually, prove that you're going to be different by coming back, building trust in the community, building relationships in the community. Again, she's been delivering that program for 6 or more years potentially. So it's like folks now in the community know her when she comes back and they remember her. So that's important as well. Secondly, providing personal support. So relational accountability means taking personal responsibility for our relationships and for our partners and for each other. And that might mean supporting people's basic and emotional needs. So we actually heard from community partners and university practitioners about the kinds of real support that they both gave and received. So helping partners achieve goals, personal goals, supporting their businesses, ensuring everyday needs are met so that they can actually participate fully. And again, some of the real examples were people bought groceries for folks. They bought a cell phone for them. They gave them car rides if they needed to, or bus fare, right? So these are like real ways that and they're doing that from their personal money. In some case, you can build these things into your budget, right? So that you have some money, if needed. But actually doing this from your own money too shows like, hey, I care. We're actually friends. This goes beyond our university partnership. But it's important too to only promise what you're actually going to deliver. And if you say you're going to do something, to do it. So following through on our commitments is the next principle practice that we heard about. So once we've entered into relationship with Indigenous communities, we have that lasting responsibility to show up even after formal partnerships have ended. So if you remember those 5 stages of Indigenous community engagement, it starts with the work before the work, and it ends with the relationship after the work. So relational accountability continues even after we've completed our projects or closed our partnerships. And that last stage is an important reminder of that. And so something that had actually happened to us was one of our partners brought this to us and really helped us understand this practice and this principle, was that we had a partner here. In fact, I had a partner here in Winnipeg. It was a very short-term project and a short-term partnership with Thunderbird House. And, after the partnership, everything was fine and dandy. And we sort of, closed the partnership because it, again, had just been a short-term thing. And I thought that was the end of it. And then I met actually with the partner for this consultation. And at that meeting, he said to me, where were you when Thunderbird's house roof was damaged? You have to be there to help. The relationship doesn't end when the project is over. You have to follow up. And so So I had forgotten that I had responsibilities to my former partner. And so we could have, like, CEL or myself could have helped organize fundraisers, or, done other activities that would have helped fix their roof. But, I had just thought, oh, well, the partnership is over, so the relationship is done, and I don't have any responsibilities to my former partner. But this was a good reminder and a call to action that that's not the case, that our responsibility to care for those relationships is ongoing. Practice gratitude on an ongoing basis. I mean, this one's pretty clear. You can share gratitude verbally, or you can give gifts, or visit. Again, Annie and Hedda, both in their communities, when they arrive in the communities, they visit people, they share gifts, and then when parting ways, say goodbye properly. So again, when they're leaving the community, they make other rounds to community partners and community members that they're friends or have relationships with, and they may share gifts again, or at least just, say a meaningful goodbye. So whether it's the end of a program cycle for the year, or it's the end of a program or partnership, it's really important that we demonstrate gratitude and spend time reflecting with partners and community members, and address any conflicts that happened, because sometimes we leave things behind and we might think that they're over, but they're not over. And so we had heard from one community member during our consultations about the lasting hurt and confusion that had been caused by a relationship that had ended abruptly with no communication. And that community is actually still waiting to hear what went wrong, or why, the partnership ended. But essentially, they just, emails weren't returned, phone calls weren't returned. And so there's this, like, lasting pain. And what happens too is that that's like an institutional burden that and then and the next partner may have to really work through, because that trust has been broken. It's important too, when you're parting ways, again, whether it's the end of the year or if it's the end of the program entirely, to talk to the community about any protocols or ceremonies that might be in place for saying goodbye properly. And then a last piece here we heard was, again, just to be honest about whether or not you're going to be able to continue that relationship. So if you know that a program or partnership is ending, and you're not willing to return or maintain that relationship, then it's best to be honest about it, rather than to be like, yeah, we're going to try and come back, and never have real intentions about returning. And then finally, just assessing the relationship on an ongoing basis. So as Annie mentioned on our first slide of this Lunch and Learn PowerPoint, that our framework is focused on building relationships, but also taking care of those relationships. It's this, like, ongoing lifelong process, and we need to pay attention to changes in the relationship in levels of trust, quality, involvement, communication, and put in the time and effort needed to rebuild or build healthy, interesting, and caring relationships. So that's essentially it. I have a quick story that I wanted to share, and then we're going to move into our reflection period for this workshop. But I was thinking about a story that had happened several years ago. So as I've mentioned a couple times during this presentation, Annie coordinates a student program in Leaf Rapids, which is a community in northern Manitoba, if folks aren't aware. And I had actually joined her on one of her visits at the very beginning of our consultations back in early 2018. So this was my first visit to Leaf Rapids. And I think that I built some really great relationships in community. This gentleman here is Jake Fortin, and I think of him like my grandpa. We had actually just popped in on him, Annie and I, and he was making soup and bannock, so we stuck around to help out and have lunch. But so anyways, during our few weeks that we were in that community, we were popping in on neighbors, chatting with everyone we met. Annie has longstanding relationships in the community, and so people, stop her and the students and ask them what they're up to and whatnot. And so at the end of the a few weeks visit, we were returning home, and it's about a 12.5-hour drive. And so I was getting a little shut eye, and Annie was actually debriefing with the students. And they were reflecting on their experience of, like, building relationships and community. And she had asked the students if they knew people in their own neighborhoods back in Winnipeg the way that folks in Leaf Rapids knew and had relationships with their neighbors, and even the way we had, built relationships with our neighbors and other folks in Leaf Rapids. And then, she followed up asking about what are the barriers that stop us from having the kinds of relationships here in Winnipeg that we have in Leaf Rapids. And so, the students wondered, it's like, is this a small town mentality? There's not as much people, it's easier. They thought maybe life in Winnipeg is different. You don't have that same feeling here of like closeness. But I think, ultimately they landed on this realization, this recognition that there is a fundamentally different approach to relationships in Indigenous communities. But it doesn't have to just be Indigenous communities, right? There's this sense of like love, of friendship, of family. We make time for people. Annie and I were just chatting about this, and she said, folks here will call and say, hey, do you want to hang out? And you're like, nah, I'm watching Netflix. In Leaf, that wouldn't happen. It would be like, definitely, let's go, hang out and play a game of, werewolf. So anyways, the students at the end of the debrief set an intention to prioritize relationships in Winnipeg in the same way that we prioritize relationships in communities. So I just wanted to share this story with you before leading into our reflection question for today. So for those of you who've been attending, you know what's happening next. We're going to put you into breakout rooms and talk about this question. So what are some of your personal or professional boundaries, and are they culturally appropriate? And how would you go about communicating or challenging these boundaries when you're doing relationship building work with communities? So Annie has posted that in the chat, because you will not be able to see the slides anymore when you move into your rooms. So I just wanted to invite at this point Annie or Hedda to add any thoughts or anything at this point. I see Hedda giving me the thumbs up. I'm not sure. I can't see Annie. Actually, I have my chat window open instead of my...
nothing to add. We can move in.
Okay. So I think Hedda's going to move us now into breakout rooms, and we will see you back in about 10 or 15 minutes or so, and just to unpack kind of our conversations before we move into the next hour.
I see that some folks left before the activity, so I'm just gonna